On this episode of The Road Chose Me, I'm exploring Sudan, and it's absolutely beautiful. So it's just 7:30 in the morning, and just made my morning coffee, and I'm out of bed here. I found this wild camp last night. I'm only maybe 2 miles away from the main highway, but here I am. It's fairly rocky here today in this spot. Yesterday where I was more sand dunes. The desert seems to change all the time. It's really fascinating how it goes from rocky to mountainous to desert to sandy, kind of all in the span of a couple of 100 miles. And so yeah, I'm just about to start cooking breakfast, another early morning, and I'll walk up the ridge here and show you what it looks like. The Nile River is just on the other side of the highway, and so now I'm following the Nile straight north up towards Egypt, which I'll cross into maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after tomorrow. I haven't quite decided yet. I'm really enjoying my time here in Sudan. People have been unbelievably friendly. They go out of their way to greet me, to welcome me to Sudan, even though we don't share a language. They speak very little English, most people. Even yesterday I was stopped on the side of the road just looking at maps and stuff, and a couple of people pulled over just to ask if I was okay and if I needed anything, and then they invited me for a meal in their house simply because I was there. So yeah, Sudanese people are just unbelievably friendly, and the landscape here is so beautiful. It's really hard to wrap your head around. You're in this unbelievably harsh desert, but then in the distance is the Nile River. You can see it there. There's just a huge big strip of green, palm trees and farming where everyone lives right along the river shore. But everything else, just wide open desert. So absolutely stunning. Thoroughly enjoying Sudan. Let's back up a little bit and go to the very beginning of my time in Sudan. Here I am leaving that wild camp that I showed you last video after I just crossed the border. So this is in the far south of Sudan, right near the border with Ethiopia. Sudan to me is such an interesting country. I can't wait to dive into it and see what it's all about. It's one of those countries where if you read government warnings, it would be a complete no-go in terms of safety. But everyone I've ever met that's been to Sudan really enjoyed it. They said it was extremely safe to wild camp and that locals were really, really friendly. So it seems like people who visit there love it, but people who've never been put out warnings about how you can't go there. So this has been the interesting thing that I've found all across Africa, is that the government warnings and all of that stuff, they're not really representative of what the reality on the ground is for a traveller like me. My visit here is right in the beginning of 2019, just before the coup when the locals overthrew their dictator leader that had been ruling for way too long. I've been warned not to go to certain districts in Khartoum, the capital, because the citizens are protesting heavily. Although I did hear one amazing story where a foreigner got caught up in the protests. The tens of thousands of people stopped protesting and waved him through until he was safely out of the way, and then the protesting resumed again. So it seems like even when they're protesting against the government, the Sudanese people are extremely kind and respectful to foreigners. See the big line of cars and trucks on the left? These people are all lining up to try and buy gas and diesel, which is in short supply all across the country. It's insanely cheap here in Sudan. Gas is about 35 cents a gallon and diesel is about 10 cents a gallon because they refine their own. But because Sudan is cut off from the international money markets, they have a really hard time selling it and then buying things from foreign countries. And I think what's happening is the government is selling all they're producing so they can get whatever money they can, but that means then there's none left for the citizens of the country. So buying gas in Sudan is a headache, just like it was in Ethiopia. In stark contrast, however, whenever I try to join a lineup of people waiting, they immediately try to usher me to the front of the line. They absolutely will not let me wait, even when I insist. And so eventually I wind up at the front of the line where the people are more than happy to fill my tank. They understand I'm just a foreigner passing through, and they don't want to inconvenience me by having me wait days like they have to. I feel bad doing it, but the people absolutely will not let me wait in line. And so all I can do is say thanks 100 times, fill my tank, pay the few dollars it costs, and then move along. Here's a photo of the first station I managed to buy gas at, and then the second photo here is the line stretching into the distance. After I took this photo, some men told me to put my camera away, and I was later told that because of all the government protests, regular citizens are really not happy about people taking photos out in public like this. I'll have to be more careful. I stopped in this town to buy some bread and groceries, and I accidentally left the GoPro running on the wing mirror. I've always been curious whether the Jeep draws attention sitting on a street like this, and so I find this footage kind of fascinating. As you can see, people completely ignore the Jeep. It's just another vehicle. They don't care at all. I move further north and simply wild camp a mile or so off the road out in the desert. The local farm owner comes to say hello, and he's perfectly happy for me to wild camp there, and even shows me some fruit that I can pick off his tree and eat. Talk about friendly. Further north, I start approaching the capital of Khartoum, and I really have no idea what to expect. As I mentioned earlier, Sudan is cut off from the international currency markets. This is because Sudan has been placed on the list of 5 bad countries in the world. So for the first time in my life, my Visa and debit card absolutely will not work here in any fashion. It also means that Sudan can't buy things on the global market. Any country caught trading with them will get severe penalties from the global markets. So I was kind of surprised as I drive into Khartoum. I see a lot of brands that I recognize. Keep your eyes to the left here. I'm driving past the international airport, and you can see there are at least 50 jetliners just sitting on the runways rotting out in the weather. I've never seen that before. I see a lot of modern infrastructure, and I see companies like Caterpillar and Xerox, big global brands that somehow have still maintained a presence in Khartoum even through all of these sanctions. The traffic is crazy as usual, but it doesn't seem anything out of the ordinary for what I've gotten used to. Of course, the temperature is scorching. In the city, I have a few jobs to complete. I manage to fill my tank with gas again, and I find a fantastic place to camp right on the Nile River in downtown Khartoum, actually at the sailing club. Here's what it looked like popping the roof of the Jeep in the scorching parking lot of the sailing club, and then here's a view along the river, first one direction, then the other. I probably wasn't supposed to take the photo of the bridge, but oh well. I've brought cash US dollars with me, which I can exchange on the black market for a lot more than the official rate, which makes everything in the country really cheap. I try to buy some bread off a local guy, but he says it's complicated and hard to find, and he'll bring me some in the morning. When he shows up in the morning, he has a whole grocery bag full of fresh baked bread and absolutely refuses to take my money. He says, "You're in Sudan, my friend. You are my guest. You are welcome here." These people have so little and their currency is crumbling, and yet they're still happy to give away food to a complete stranger. This is unbelievable. I've never experienced hospitality like this in my life. After a couple of nights in the city and some delicious spicy street food, it's time to wave goodbye to Khartoum and keep moving north. I've teamed up with my Swiss friends again, and so together we push on into the desert, seeking out all of the local ruins and temples. A lot of them are simply way out in the middle of nowhere, but obviously Sudan now has realized that they can capitalize on the few tourists that do visit, and so a couple of them have an entry fee that's as high as $20 US. Here in Sudan, that's a small fortune. At night, we simply pull off the side of the road and camp wherever we want. There's absolutely nobody out here, and the stars are breathtaking. Here's the temperature on the dash, just as I pulled into camp at sunset. I've seen much higher numbers during the day, but this is pretty hot given that the sun isn't even up anymore. The desert feels immense, and it's hard to imagine that anyone could possibly live out here. But of course they do, as always, and they're finding a way to scratch a living. These friendly guys came over near one of the temples and tried really hard to sell me a camel ride. The Temple of Moreau is one of Sudan's most famous tourist attractions, probably just because it's fairly close to Khartoum. It's out here slowly being reclaimed by the desert stands, and it's absolutely breathtaking. I don't know the history, but I'm pretty sure these ruins actually outdate most of the temples and pyramids in Egypt, and that this is where settlement first happened way back in the day. We find a magic place to wild camp just a mile or so behind these pyramids, and spend a stunning night out in the desert, knowing how close we are to some of the first human civilizations on Earth. Here I wave goodbye to my Swiss friends who are going to head east and eventually catch a ferry across to Saudi Arabia and then drive back to Europe through the Middle East. They've got exciting adventures ahead, but I'm pretty dead set on getting up to Egypt and finishing the trip as I originally planned. So I pop back out on the paved road and start putting down the miles. As you can see, there really is nothing out here, and I drive for hundreds of miles at a time like this, just out in nothingness in between the cities and towns that do inevitably crop up, usually close to the Nile River. At times, the blowing sand dunes are trying to retake the highway, which reminds me strongly of my time in Mauritania almost 3 years ago. In the evening, I just strike off the road into the dunes about a mile and find this stunning place to camp all alone. The footage you're watching now is actually me driving away from that wild camp soon after sunrise. You can see the dunes just go in every direction endlessly, and when I do eventually find my way back to the highway, it's just this tiny strip of pavement carved into the desert. It's really amazing they managed to build a road out here, and there's essentially nothing else. I'm loving my time out in the desert, though unfortunately the wind is relentless and really starts to get on my nerves. It's actually difficult to spend time outside the Jeep. So as much as I would love to linger and maybe spend an entire 24 hours camping somewhere like this, I just can't handle the wind rattling on my nerves the entire time. A little further along, I find this amazing temple right on the side of the road. I think anywhere else in the world there'd be a $50 entry fee, but here in Sudan, there isn't even a single person hanging around, and I have the whole place to myself. The gas shortage continues to be a problem across Sudan, and so I duck into every little town and village I can to see what the situation is. Often there's a huge line for diesel, and then an entirely different line for gas. Once again, nobody can believe that my big four-wheel drive is actually gas-powered, but once I convince them, it's usually okay and we figure it out. I arrive at this lineup just as, it seems, they're starting to pump gas. I don't know why, but there's only a couple of cars waiting for gas and tons waiting for diesel. Works perfectly in my favour. I cross the Nile yet again and continue north on the west side up to the Temple of Soleb. Again, stunningly beautiful, and again, there's nobody here. I'd love to cross the border on the western side of the river, but unfortunately I've organised a lot of complicated paperwork for Egypt and I have to cross at the more popular eastern border. So I backtrack a little and then find this ferry across the Nile River. It's extremely cheap and everyone's really friendly. The desert roads in Sudan feel endless, and wild camping in the desert has been amazing. As I roll into the world-famous town of Wadi Halfa, I know that I've achieved great things. Crossing here from Sudan into Egypt is going to be a monumental task. Until next time, Sudan, I really can't wait to come back.